Hi, this is Gerie DiPiano, and you are listening to or possibly watching the Love Mia Vita podcast. Today's conversation is with Dr. Mark Ratner, and we're going to be sharing some information on something called the Honest Conversation, THC, but we're really describing what has happened with respect to the fervor, the enthusiasm, and all the hype over using products like CBD and THC in their ability or lack thereof to ameliorate certain symptoms that we may be experiencing. Now, Dr. Ratner is an expert in a number of different areas, among them nutrition, but he is also a board-certified urologist and co-founder of Therologics, which is a company based in the United States in Rockville, Maryland. Dr. Ratner, welcome to the Love Mia Vita podcast, and perhaps you can share with our audience more about your background, which is quite distinguished.
Well, thanks for having me, Gerie. I went to medical school a few years ago. But before I went to medical school, after I finished my undergraduate studies at Cornell, I decided to stick around at Cornell and went into a master's program in nutrition. Cornell back then was already kind of known as a center for nutrition education. And I think that's only expanded these days with the T. Colin Campbell Center. He is sort of an emeritus professor now at the Cornell Department of Nutrition. Back when I was taking his course, he was an assistant professor. So that tells you how many years ago it was.
A couple of years ago.
A couple of years ago. And then I went off to medical school. And after medical school, I trained I did my residency in urology, and then ended up in practice subspecializing in male fertility. I spent most of my time working with a very large IVF practice and doing male factor fertility work. About 20 years ago, my old training in nutrition piqued my interest in work that was being published looking at the impact of certain micronutrients on prostate cancer risk. There was a lot of very exciting stuff getting published, which seemed to indicate that diet and lifestyle could really impact a man's risk of prostate cancer. And when we say diet, we're also talking about specific nutrients, things like soy and green tea, and nutrients like lycopene, vitamin D. And so with my background in nutrition, I got together with some of the full-time faculty people I knew here in the Mid-Atlantic, and we started a company called Therologics. And the purpose at first was to really just try to commercialize the research that was being published about nutrition and prostate cancer risk. And that's where we started almost 20 years ago. And the company has grown and evolved. And so we now have a presence in many different sort of specialty areas. Started out in urology and male fertility. And then we also worked into OBGYN and reproductive endocrinology, which basically means the IVF world. And then maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, I was at a medical conference, and a reproductive endocrinologist that I knew, these are the doctors that do IVF, he came up to me and he said, "Do you know of any approaches, nutritional approaches, for women who have endometriosis?" And I said, I have not really read of anything. Let me look into it. And so I started doing some checking in the literature to see what kind of nutritional approaches or nutrient approaches had ever been tried in endometriosis. And I crossed paths with a compound called PEA. which is short for palmitoyl ethanolamide, which is why we simply call it PEA. It's sort of a mouthful. And it turned out that this compound was a cannabinoid. And I was sort of familiar with the term cannabinoid, but my association with the term cannabinoid was with cannabis. And, you know, my familiarity with cannabis dates back 40 years, but at the same time, what I was quickly able to understand was that the science behind cannabinoid physiology had really exploded in the past 20 years. And shockingly, it's something that is incredibly important. It involves natural substances that our body produces. And yet a survey that was done, I think about 3 years ago, showed that less than 20% of medical schools in the United States are actually teaching cannabinoid science in their curriculum. So it's still, I think, a prisoner of the old, reefer madness. Cannabis is, there are people who are still
I
in
saw
prison.
that too. I saw the movie at Johns Hopkins University.
I mean, the problem is that there's really, really exciting science that is just now being explored, because for many, many years, the government had cannabis scheduled as what's called a Schedule 1 substance on the Drug Enforcement Agency's list of controlled substances. So it was considered no different than heroin or LSD.
Yes.
And obviously that's now changed in many states. I don't know what the numbers, it's probably up to about 20 states by now, where it's actually legal for recreational use, cannabis, and even more states where there's the possibility of using it with a doctor's oversight, for medical use. But nevertheless, the question that was posed to me about endometriosis led me to this compound, as I said, PEA, and it led me to really begin to understand what we call the endocannabinoid system, the human endocannabinoid system.
So if we could go back and look at the endocannabinoid system and what does that entail? There are receptors in our body,
right,
that are part of this system, but the contribution to overall wellness is really important. So perhaps you could share with those listening and watching.
So the history of how this was discovered is really fascinating. Cannabis, marijuana, has been known for thousands of years to have certain medicinal qualities. I mean, there are ancient Chinese medicine texts from 2,000 years ago that call for the use of cannabis for certain types of problems. But nobody really understood what it was in cannabis that was affecting the body up until about the early 1960s. And what happened in the early 1960s was a scientist, it was actually a number of scientists around the world, but the guy who really led the research was an Israeli organic chemist. His name is Raphael Mechoulam. He's still alive. He's like 94 years old at this point. He's considered the father of cannabis science. And he was the guy who first isolated and characterized both THC and CBD. Those are the two primary bioactive compounds that are found in cannabis. And so he proved that those were the compounds that were affecting the human body. But the question then was, why should we, how is it that we as humans have this effect from compounds that are only found in this one plant? Well, it turns out we have receptors throughout our body. And those receptors are what THC and CBD bind to. And we call those receptors cannabinoid receptors. There are two primary cannabinoid receptors we call CB1 or cannabinoid 1 and CB2. So CB1 receptors are primarily in the brain and central nervous system, spinal cord, and CB2 receptors are primarily in the immune system. So the CB2 receptors are found in the spleen, they're found in the bone marrow, they're found on white blood cells, okay? So then the question became, why should we have receptors for these compounds, these two plant compounds, only found in one plant? Why should our bodies have evolved these receptors? And it turns out, logically, that in our bodies, we make signaling molecules that are designed to bind to those receptors. So the body basically makes its own versions of THC and CBD, and we call those endocannabinoids. Endo meaning within. So when we say the endocannabinoid system or the human endocannabinoid system, what we're talking about is a system of signaling molecules, signaling compounds, and receptors that are found naturally in our tissues. And this is analogous to the opioids. 200 years ago, they discovered morphine. They extracted morphine from the opium poppy. And it's the same question. Why should, how is it that this compound, morphine, affects our brains? And it took 175 years, okay? It wasn't until like 40 years ago, they discovered that we've got these receptors in our brain, which are opiate receptors. And the same exact thing, why do we have opiate receptors? Because we make our own version of morphine. It's called endorphin. And so the body's system is essentially, it's very similar in terms of the cannabinoids. The human endocannabinoid system is these two receptors, CB1, CB2, and then several different signaling compounds or molecules. The one that was first discovered was called AEA, which is short for a very long chemical name, arachidonyl ethanolamide. But Meshulam, the Israeli scientist, he nicknamed it anandamide. And the reason he called it anandamide is because ananda is the Sanskrit word for bliss. And it's an amide. And we produce this chemical naturally in our brains, and it can create a bliss-like state. And so that's why he nicknamed it anandamide. So anandamide or AEA was the first signaling compound discovered. And then the second one was called 2AG. And now other ones have been discovered as well. And one of those is called PEA, palmitoyl ethanolamide. It's a signaling molecule that is made in human tissue. And its purpose, and actually, let me back up a little bit. What's the purpose of the whole endocannabinoid system? Why do we have it? How does it help us? What's the function that it serves? The answer is, probably the simplest way to put this, is that the purpose of the endocannabinoid system is to return us to baseline after something in the environment creates a response in our body. Now, what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is when something triggers neurotransmitter release in our brain, we don't want the neurotransmitters to just keep releasing and releasing and releasing and releasing. And so what happens is when neurotransmitters are released in the brain, it triggers the release of anandamide, which then goes back, binds to the CB1 receptors in the brain, and slows down neurotransmitter release. So basically, it's a negative feedback loop. And that's what's happening both with CB1 in the neural system, the brain and spinal cord, and in CB2. So if you stimulate the CB2 receptor, what you're basically doing is you're down-regulating inflammatory response. You're down-regulating immune response, calming down the immune system. It's a return to baseline. And that's really, the endocannabinoid system is ancient. It's been estimated that it evolved 500 million years ago. Every single vertebrate has these same molecules and receptors, the signaling molecules and receptors. So it's ubiquitous throughout all vertebrate species. And it's really fascinating because until this research, and the AEA, 2AG, CB1, CB2 receptors, those were first discovered in 1993. Okay, I mean, this is like very recently discovered stuff. And so, the big pharma, they're hard at work. Okay, they're trying to figure out how do you build compounds, scientifically, how do you build compounds that will bind to these receptors, basically synthetic cannabinoid signaling molecules. So, then the question is, where does medical cannabis fit in? Okay, medical cannabis, which is THC, CBD, and then dozens of other compounds in the cannabis plant. You not only have THC and CBD, but you have CBG and CBN and CBZ, and then you've got a whole nother class of compounds in cannabis, which are called terpenes. Terpenes are the essential oils which give cannabis its very unique smell. And there's over 100 different terpenes that are found in cannabis. Some of those have bioactivity. And so when you use cannabis medically, you're getting what people in the medical cannabis world call the entourage effect. You're basically getting all of these compounds working together. But that's pretty unpredictable. And if you ever go into a cannabis dispensary, like a medical cannabis dispensary, and you look at the dozens of different strains of cannabis, and you walk in there and you talk to the person behind the desk,
Bud master,
the blend, or they also call them what do they call them? Bud tenders.
Yes, bud tender, bud master. Yes,
they call them bud tenders, and unfortunately, the bud tenders, they're not trained medically. Okay, and so if you go in there and you say, I've been having problems with my lower back, or I chronic issues with anxiety, or with whatever your complaint is that you want to use medical cannabis for, the bud tender is going to help you pick a strain. There is less than zero science going on there. Okay, so it's, I think the initial excitement and the initial hype that that accompanied medical cannabis legalization in many states, and then recreational, and then CBD. I mean, there are some very, very, very big bets placed in the CBD world. I think CBD was basically legalized in the United States in the 2018 Farm Bill. So at the end of 2018, the Farm Bill that was passed legalized hemp. Now, what is hemp? Hemp is cannabis that has less than 0.3% THC by dry weight. Okay. And so therefore, any ingredients, any compounds that are in a hemp plant can be sold legally according to the DEA. Okay. And so that meant CBD could be sold according to the DEA. Now, the other agency, though, in the government that supervises these things is the FDA. So while something became legal according to the DEA, the FDA has still not figured out how it wants to handle CBD. But that didn't stop there from being a huge gold rush of companies that were rushing to market with tons and tons of CBD products. Everything from soft gels to tinctures to balms that you would rub on your skin, all different types of applications for CBD. And it turned out that the hemp crop that was planted in 2019, something like 80% of it went unharvested because they so overestimated the demand. And it may be that the pendulum is swinging both ways, but the two biggest companies in the CBD world, Charlotte's Web and CBDMD, they are really been knocked back on their heels. I mean, they're suffering. Their stock prices are down about 95% from their high. So the CBD hype has sort of died down quite a bit.
Yes, it really has. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of science, even in the space of pain, alleviation of pain, particularly when the no drug studies have actually, or no clinical studies have been performed doing dose ranging. And when we say dose ranging, so what's the lowest dose, which is the intermediate dose, which is the highest effect, which is the highest dose that can be administered safely to an individual. So if there's no data, what you're relying on is mostly anecdotal information. And as a drug developer and as a consumer now health company, we also understand that when you're looking at pain, in particular, amelioration of pain, it's very subjective. So when you do prescription drugs, you tend to have studies that are quite heavily populated in order to show statistical significance. Pain studies are very difficult because there's a high placebo effect. So if you think you're feeling better, in layperson language, if you think you're feeling better, you may actually move from zero pain to moderate relief to even more significant relief of pain. So yeah, I'm feeling pretty good because that's part of the placebo effect. And it really depends on the dose. We've looked at CBD products as an example with 100, 300, 500 milligrams of CBD, and they really aren't going to do anything. 1,000 milligrams of CBD, we still don't know. Is that more significant in terms of dose, or is that just cutting the surface? There's no science to prove that. So there is no good science. And that's part of the problem. So when we think about this, we think that from a regulatory point of view, we really need to be doing more investigation. And that investigation probably requires full clinical trials on these types of products, both from the safety perspective and also to show that they are efficacious at a particular dosage level and in a specific population. I mean, as women's health experts at FemPharma, which the Love Mia Vita podcast is sponsored by my company, FemPharma, we want to do what is right for humans, especially for women at all ages. So we don't know what the safety is in a population of women in the reproductive age group cohort. And as they transition into perimenopause and postmenopause, these are all considerations that one must undertake in order to demonstrate the safety. And that's the first thing. Safety is paramount. And then looking at, does it work? Is it efficacious? That's the other important criteria. If it doesn't work, why bother to develop it? But there are some natural products I think you described that can kind of reset our bodies and can help us if we have this endocannabinoid deficiency. And those supplements, because they're naturally occurring in the body, can be relatively safely used without huge concern. We talk about what can set off or what can throw off the endocannabinoid system. And I was surprised to learn that pretty much anything, I mean, stress can set it off, trauma can set it off, certain diseases. You mentioned endometriosis, irritable bowel syndrome. So all of those diseases and disorders can throw off the ECS. We're not going to race to, our dispensary. I mean, for those of you that believe in, medical marijuana, this is not to be disrespectful to anybody that uses that in a responsible way. But there are some other things that are available to us, and those are the natural products that occur in the body that can be harnessed. And I think one of the ones that you mentioned was PEA.
Yeah, PEA is it's an incredibly interesting story how that was discovered. Um, PEA was actually discovered back in the 1940s in New York, where there were many different orphanages in New York City in the early 1940s. Some of them were better funded than others. And back in the early 1940s, antibiotics were not widely available. And so if a kid got strep throat, got a strep infection, there was no penicillin to treat it. And so typically what would happen was eventually the body would get rid of the infection, but there was a very high risk after a strep infection that was untreated that the child could develop what's called rheumatic fever. Rheumatic fever is the result of an untreated strep infection. And when they looked at these orphanages, a scientist from Columbia University realized that the kids in the orphanages that had the best funding had extremely low rates of rheumatic fever compared to the orphanages that were sort of funded through the city and they were scrambling and had low budgets. And so they started looking at how are these kids being treated differently? Because they were all getting the same risk of strep infection, but the groups at the better orphanages didn't get rheumatic fever. And what they settled on, what they found out, was that the groups in the better orphanages were being fed eggs on a daily basis. And they actually isolated a compound from egg yolks, which they identified as palmitoyl ethanolamide. It's basically an amide of palmitic acid. It's a fairly simple compound. But they realized that that was protective. Somehow that was preventing the immune system from overreacting to the strep infection and creating rheumatic fever afterwards. And so this was actually when PEA was first discovered. It was discovered as a component in egg yolks. They had no idea that it was actually something that was actually also made in human tissue. And nobody understood the science. Nobody really understood why it worked, how it worked. And interest in the United States sort of fell away, despite the fact that Merck had, I think they filed patents on it back in the 1940s. But in Europe, they got a tremendous amount of interest still. They had a lot of interest still. And so they started doing clinical trials. And PEA has been studied in Europe since really the 1960s. And it was a prescription medication available in Europe during the 1960s and early 70s. And then after the Iron Curtain fell in the 1980s, PEA sort of disappeared in Europe as a prescription medication. And finally, a bunch of researchers about 20 years ago, in the early 2000s, started looking at started doing really good clinical trials using PEA. And what they figured out was, and this coincided with the point at which they realized that it was probably an analog chemically similar to AEA, anandamide.
Interesting.
Right? It was also a fatty acid amide, just like the other cannabinoid signaling molecules. And so in about 2008, scientists in Italy figured out what was PEA binding to, which receptors was it binding to, how did it work? And we know now how it works. PEA is endogenously produced in our tissues. The reason we can create it as a supplement, though, is because it's also found in certain foods. It's found in egg yolks, which we mentioned, but it's also found in peanuts and soy. Now, the amount that's found in those foods is small. And in order to create it as a supplement, you couldn't just extract it. It would be cost prohibitive to do it as an extract. And so it's a very simple molecule. It's just palmitic acid with an ethanolamide molecule. And so it gets synthesized in basically a manufacturing facility. But it's chemically identical to the signaling molecule that we make in our tissues. There have now been placebo-controlled clinical trials looking at the ability of PEA to improve patients with carpal tunnel syndrome, osteoarthritis of the knee, sciatica and back pain, endometriosis, even depression. There's a clinical trial that was published about 10 years ago. Patients that were newly diagnosed with depression were randomized into two groups, either Celexa plus placebo or Celexa plus PEA. And then over the course of 8 weeks, every couple of weeks, these subjects in this clinical trial, they took a depression index test. It's a way to score the severity of their depression. And if you compared the two groups, there were statistically significant differences. The people who took Celexa plus PEA, they got better faster and more completely. The level of depression dropped more thoroughly than Celexa alone. Now, well, you might say, well, why is that? The reason is because people who are moderately to severely depressed have inflammatory changes in their brain as a result of that depression. And the PEA has been shown to decrease neuroinflammation. So carpal tunnel, sciatica, osteoarthritis of the knee, depression, a study that was published 2 weeks ago. This is an incredible study. It was done in Australia, PEA versus placebo, in patients who had diabetic peripheral neuropathy. Now, peripheral neuropathy, if anybody's been diabetic for more than, say, 20 years, there's about a 1 in 4 chance that they will have developed peripheral neuropathy, where the nerves in typically their hands and feet are not sending signals properly. And it can be very painful. And so there's really no good standard treatment for it. When patients have this kind of problem, sometimes they're given tricyclic antidepressants, sometimes they're treated with Neurontin or Lyrica, but these are off-label uses of these drugs. Those drugs all have side effects and they're not particularly effective. So in this clinical trial done in Australia, published 2 weeks ago, PEA versus placebo, double-blinded study, the PEA group had anywhere from a 50 to 60% reduction in the severity of pain, a 50% improvement in the quality of their sleep compared to placebo, less paresthesias. I mean, it was dramatic data. So the point is, PEA is sort of the body's natural form of CBD. And it's been studied for now 20 years in a much more extensive manner than CBD has been. And there's ongoing trials with PEA now. One of the side effects with certain types of chemotherapy can be neuropathy, where the chemotherapy drugs damage nerve endings and you end up with neuropathy in the hands or feet. And so there's a clinical trial going on right now, sponsored by the National Cancer Institute, looking to see multiple doses, like you said, sort of a dose ranging study of PEA and also placebo in patients undergoing cancer treatment with chemotherapy to see whether it will reduce that type of neuropathy as well. So PEA is an exciting compound. It's just really starting to get more attention here in the United States. It's been well understood and widely used in Europe for a number of years, but here in the States, we suffer sometimes from what we call NIH syndrome.
Not invented here.
Not invented here, exactly, yeah. And, so PEA is a good example of that. But I think individuals are getting access to it easily. One thing I should point out is that using PEA for any of these chronic inflammatory pain conditions or chronic neuropathies. I mean, look, carpal tunnel and sciatica, those are compression neuropathies. That's where the nerves in question, whether it's the median nerve in the wrist for carpal tunnel or the sciatic nerve in the back, they're being compressed. And that's what's damaging the nerve. So we would call that a mechanical or compression neuropathy. And then you've got diabetic neuropathies, and then you've got autoimmune neuropathies, and you've got chemotherapy-induced neuropathies. So there's a lot of different types of neuropathies, and it's starting to look like PEA can work against most, if not all of them. So it's an exciting compound. The research is expanding, more and more different indications. It's totally safe because we make it in our own tissues. You can't overdose on it. It's not broken down in the liver. You know, one of the problems with CBD is that CBD has to be broken down in the liver because it's a foreign substance. And when GW Pharma, the company that got Epidiolex approved for, which is CBD being used for seizures in children, the daily dose of CBD that these kids are getting is like 600 milligrams, anywhere from 600 to 800 milligrams per day, depending on the child's weight. They found that when you're giving that much CBD per day, it starts to interfere with the liver's ability to break down other drugs, because the liver has to work so hard dealing with all of that CBD. So another great thing about PEA is that it doesn't get broken down in the liver. It gets broken down everywhere in the body because it's being produced everywhere in the tissues. It's broken down locally. No side effects, no interactions with other medications. It's a great compound.
So we have some natural ways in which to supplement without the use of CBD/THC. Once again, if those are working for you and you are purchasing those from a reputable source, always check to make sure that these products are manufactured under GMP. That's one of the things that I will say about what Dr. Ratner has suggested about the PEA product, that it is synthesized, that it is manufactured under GMP, which is good manufacturing practices. That means that the manufacturing facility was actually inspected by the Food and Drug Administration and held to a higher standard. Please be sure that when you investigate any product that you use, that it is manufactured with the highest quality ingredients. We call them pharmaceutical grade or medical grade ingredients, and that it is manufactured under GMP. So the fact that Theralogix does manufacture these products, that they use the strictest of ways in which to do that, should make you feel more comfortable. Now, Theralogix product is called Catabrex, and you can purchase that online from Theralogix. And Dr. Ratner, I just want to say that this has been a fascinating podcast. I'm not surprised, though. Mark and I had a conversation before we actually decided to do this podcast. And he's just a wealth of information on a variety of different topics. And we're just really excited that you were able to join us for this podcast today. And we hope that you'll join us again for the part 3 on THC, the honest conversation, because there is more. There's a lot more to be shared, and appreciate the history on the endocannabinoid system, some of the pitfalls, some of the things that you ought to watch out for. So thank you for joining us, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. It was a lot of fun. And I could talk to you for another hour or two about the cannabinoids. It's really interesting stuff.
It is very interesting. So stay tuned for the next Love Mia Vita podcast. And we hope that we will be able to have Dr. Mark Ratner join us once again. Thank you. And remember to love Mia Vita, love your life. Be well.